The West Papua genocide isn't a recent thing. This has been happening since the 1960s. It actually began in 1960. In exactly 1962, the US president was told to sign off on papers that gave Indonesia control over West Papua. And that's how it all started, with Indonesia having full control over West Papua and that island. And basically, all of West Papua's resources and command was given to Indonesian power and military power. And what they did with that is Indonesia sent troops to West Papua to control the land, make sure nothing was going wrong. But they took that into almost like treat them like prisoners and second-class citizens and make sure that they don't have the same rights as everybody else. So that's when they started torturing and taking people away from their families and killing everyone. And you see photos like this of people dying due to the mass conflict in West Papua and the mass genocide of the people. This whole conflict didn't go under the radar. There were a lot of people that knew about it. The UN knew about it and they didn't do anything. Actually, the UN became a colonial power of the people of West Papua, and basically they ruled the territory and denied people permission to protest and colonize in West Papua. So if there were any protests going on with the West Papuan people, they would send Indonesian army and military personnel to stop the protest by whatever means necessary. That could be gassing them, injuring them, killing them. They were ruthless and didn't care about what the West Papua people thought or what their rights were. They treated them like they weren't people, and they put them in internment camps and killed families, and it was ruthless. And without the West Papuan consent, they didn't say that Indonesia could come and take control of their land. They were just stormed by force by the Indonesian government and weren't allowed to live on their own lands freely. The West Papuan people were treated like slaves, and there was nothing that they can do about it. Here's pictures of them in a line going to a prison, like they're prisoners and in their own country, and they can't do anything about it. They're walking with no rights and with no hope that anything's going to change. Not everybody was with the UN, and there were some people that were against it and spoke against it. One UN representative from Bolivia said that the world has a moral responsibility to the Iranese people, which are the West Papuan people. And he even said, in quote, "It is the duty of the United Nations, the industrialized countries, and everybody else to consider with seriousness, generosity, and urgency that something must be done to give the wonderful Iranese people at least the essential benefits of our so-called civilized world. It is a shame for all of us that these people have been forgotten." And there's a lot of truth to this, because we do live in a civilized world, in a mostly civilized society, where people have the right to anything that they should and should have opportunities. And with this going on, the West Papuan people have no rights, no liberty. And that's what started all the protests. And there were thousands of protests that popped up. A lot of them were in Australia, and there were some on the mainland United States too, some in London as well. And there's a lot of people from all over the world who think that the West Papuan people should have their land back and shouldn't be in control from another nation, because that's going back in history to a time where nobody had rights, and if a bit larger country wanted something, they would just go get it. But we now live in a time where everybody should have the right to their own land and should have control of their resources. Since the 1960s, the Free West Papua movement has been global, and millions of people have joined in. And it all started really with Indonesia taking over and them trying to exploit their resources. And the significance of this movement is that it wasn't just people from West Papua that were protesting. It was people from all over the Pacific Islands, Asia, Europe. They all wanted the same thing for the West Papua people, which is freedom. And that shouldn't be too hard to ask, considering that this is a nation, and a nation should be controlled by people or by a person, not by a full other country. And that's why this conflict is really still talked about today, because A, it's still going on, and B, it's going back to a time where colonialism and colonization was a big thing in the world, and countries were doing it left and right. And I'd like to think that we've evolved from that type of guerrilla type warfare where people are fighting in trenches and dying over something that really shouldn't be fought over. But it's sad to see that the Indonesian people still believe that they have control over this, when really the West Papua people should have control, and the UN had no right to give them that. And this movement is still going on today, even though it might not be as prominent and popular as it was 40 years ago. It's still getting talked about today because people there are still getting treated poorly. And if this doesn't change soon, then we might result back to how things were in the 1900s. They did do some interviews over there, but not a lot of people were allowed into West Papua due to this colonization. But there were some people that got words out and their voices were heard. And there was one man that said, "How many more of us must die before the world must help us?" And that was this man right here, a local West Papuan. And he believes that this movement should be spread more and should still be talked about. But there's not enough recognition and there's not enough people behind it for it to get the momentum to really make a difference.
For nearly half a century, West Papua has been struggling to gain back their independence from the Indonesian government, making it one of the world's longest running conflict. Since Indonesia took control of West Papua in 1969, an estimated number of 500,000 indigenous West Papuans have been tortured, raped, and slaughtered under the hands of the Indonesian military. These mass killings add to the continuous genocide of the native Papuans, which to this day is still being concealed from the public by those who profit from the ongoing injustice on the indigenous Papuans. West Papua contains the western half of the island of Papua New Guinea and is part of the group of islands that make up Melanesia in the South Pacific. The history of West Papuan Melanesians is that they migrated from Africa over 50,000 years ago and have been living in peace and harmony ever since, until they were invaded and colonized by the Dutch in 1898. The English colonized Papua New Guinea and handed over administrative control to the Australian government, who then annexed the island. In 1907, the Dutch military personnel conducted a geological survey and discovered an abundance of rich mineral deposits and resources such as gold, silver, oil, etc. The discovery did not aid the West Papuans with their desire for independence for their ancestral land, but rather ultimately sealed their fate for colonization. In 1961, West Papuans held a congress to discuss independence and raised the West Papuan Morning Star flag. But when Indonesia declared its own independence, they wanted to take West Papua as part of their newly formed territory. This caused a conflict between Indonesia, the Netherlands or the Dutch, and the indigenous population. However, Robert Kennedy, who was a U.S. Senator at the time, got both countries to agree to a negotiation, resulting in the writing of a United Nations-sponsored treaty in 1962, known as the New York Agreement. This agreement resulted with the Netherlands handing over West Papua to the UN, promising that they'll pass West Papua over to Indonesia's administration until the Papuans get a chance to vote whether they wanted to remain under Indonesian rule or become an independent nation. In 1969, however, the Indonesian military, with UN officials present, handpicked 1,026 of the 800,000 Papuans and forced them to vote to remain under Indonesian rule, or they and their families will be executed. Ever since this unethical vote, the West Papuans have been continuously fighting to take back what's theirs, take back their freedom, their ancestral lands, everything that had been stripped away from them. However, their initiative to fight back usually results in even more bloodshed and suffering and death for their own kind. What I'm about to show you is visual evidence of the massacre occurring in West Papua. It's a bit graphic, so please bear with me.
So throughout this project, one of the biggest questions that we've had going through this is why the Indonesian government wants to remain in control of West Papua so badly. Through our research, we discovered that one of the biggest reasons, and the reason that I'm going to focus on right now, is that while the Indonesian government has control of West Papua, they are also able to have control over the Grasberg mine. So Indonesia owns about 50% of this mine, which means that a lot of the money that is coming out of this mine, from the resources that they're able to gather from it, is going directly back into Indonesia's economy. So if they were to lose control over that mine, they're just going to be losing a lot of money from that. So that's definitely one of the biggest reasons that they want to remain in control. So a little bit of background on mining in West Papua. Efforts for independence were lost in the late 1960s after the Indonesian government fixed the election for the Act of Free Choice. Freeport-McMoRan Mining Company signed a contract with Freeport Indonesia to have full control of the Ertsberg mine, which is a copper and gold mine located in West Papua. And it was discovered by a Dutch geologist, so this was while the Dutch had control, was when it was discovered, before Indonesia had taken over. Freeport-McMoRan is an American mining company whose headquarters are in Phoenix, Arizona, and it is the second largest copper mining company in the world. And they currently mine in the Grasberg mine, which is also in West Papua, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So through the contract that Freeport and Freeport Indonesia have, the Indonesian government, without the authority to do so, essentially sold large parts of West Papua to be sifted through and mined as Freeport pleased. Also with this contract, the Indonesian government received significant tax revenue, fees, and 9.36% shareholding of what was produced in the Ertsberg mine. So Freeport had little to no regulations of how much they could mine and how often and how to mine, basically. So this led to extensive environmental damage, including damage to freshwater resources and landslides, which resulted in the relocation of indigenous people. In 1977, members of the Free Papua movement actually attacked the mine as a protest. The group dynamited the main slurry pipe, which caused tens of millions of dollars in damage, and attacked the mine facilities. The Indonesian military reacted harshly, killing almost 800 people in response to that protest. A few years after this protest, the resources that were coming out of Ertsberg were almost completely depleted. However, they knew that was coming, so they sent out geologists to scout the area looking for other mines to start mining and looking for resources, which is when they came across the Grasberg mine, which I was talking about earlier. The Grasberg mine is located only about 2 miles from the Ertsberg mine in West Papua. It's the largest gold mine and the second largest copper mine in the world, and it is currently owned and operated by Freeport, the same Freeport that has been mining in West Papua and destroying the land and the environment for decades. So as long as there are resources and money coming out of the mine, the Indonesian government is going to want to remain in control of the area to ensure that they have control of the resources and the money that they're receiving through that. As for the Papuans, they have been fighting for their independence for decades, and they were totally screwed over by an organization whose only purpose at the time was decolonization. The Indonesian government was able to fix the election, like I said earlier, so that they couldn't gain independence, so they could remain in control of the mine. And yeah, ever since then, the Indonesian government has been harshly violating the human rights of West Papua's indigenous people. And one of the biggest reasons for doing that to like living people is to make sure that they have that money, that flow of money coming through into the government.